Give it up for Steve.
Thank you. Okay, so I hope you guys have enjoyed the break because we're about to turn the fire hose back on. So I'm going to just jump right into it. I'll introduce myself really quickly. So my name is StevePorter. I'm one of those that have traveled in from afar. So I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. In Atlanta, I've been working with our Fortune 500 customers probably for the last, last decade. The last 6 years of that focused on cloud adoption. And in addition to my day job, I'm also a Microsoft Regional Director, which is kind of like a community champion, kind of like an MVP, but I focus on customer. So what we're going to talk about now is securing resources. So this is a big chunk of the test, right? So this is 20-25%. So you're looking at a big chunk of the questions focusing purely on security, and there's also a lot of overlap between some of the other sections. So this is a good one to focus a good bit of time on. And when you look at it, these are the 6 subsections. So I'm going to hit the first 5. We're going to start out just talking about AD and then kind of move all the way into role-based authentication or access. And then BillWilder is going to join us for number 6, and he is going to be joining us. We'll see how this works. He's going to join us over Skype for the last 10 minutes of this. So jumping right in, so the first thing we're going to talk about is just the whole managed identity paradigm in Azure, right? So this is where Azure Active Directory comes into play. The testing is really big on kind of what's available in the different SKUs or different types or the different resources. So one of the things to look at, not just for Azure AD, but across the board, is look at kind of what different pieces of the pie offer. Make sure to understand that the what, right? So this test is all about architecting. So understand what piece fits for kind of what problem, where that solution plays. So if you look in this table, you're going to see the difference between what we've traditionally had Active Directory on-premise to now what we have in the cloud. And it's over the past 2 years probably, these two have started to really merge, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But when you look at things like AD Connect, ADFS, even AD Connect single sign-on gets even closer where you actually have pass-through authentication. So they're definitely getting closer. And then even with Azure AD, so the cloud section of this, you've got a lot of kind of sub-SKUs and options for each one. So there will absolutely be questions on here, and something that you just need to know as an architect is what features fall into which category, right? You've got free, you've got basic, you've got premium. What do I need? You don't want to buy premium just because, right? You don't want to upgrade further than you need to. So know for a given solution, what AD features do I actually need, and then what SKU does that map to? And this is, so if you look at kind of most of these slides, you're going to see that I've got either links here or I've got links in the comments. So there's a lot of content kind of beyond this to dig into. So for every slide, you're probably going to have at least one link and some comments. For a lot of them, I've got a ton of contextual information in there that digs into things further. So as you're going through this content, make sure to hit the links because it's going to explode out and give you a whole lot more context to kind of the glimpse of what you're going to get on the actual slide. And then when you get into kind of the top tier of AD, right? So this is kind of the kitchen sink. Wait, let me go back a couple slides real quick. So one of the big things that it didn't really hit me until I started using Cloud AD, kind of the big difference you get with Active Directory in the cloud versus Active Directory on-prem is the whole device angle, right? You've got computers, you've got printers, you've got kind of all of these other things in addition to just people that are joined to your Active Directory, right? So that's something that's not in the cloud right now. Sure would be cool, probably something that's eventually on the roadmap, not something you need to know for this exam, but it would be something that would be very compelling to have it as your one-stop shop across the board for domain joined everything, device management, blah, blah, blah. But just for the exam, it's good to know that that is kind of that big point of segregation where you've got users and then, on-prem you've got users and ... And you've also got a lot more features that you're on-prem that you don't get necessarily through the Cloud AD. You want to look through the mappings specifically for basic and premium. Look at what you get. Know that when you'll get a question like, which category of Azure AD do I need to use for this? And you'll need to be able to answer that. So you need to know the different features that fall under each SKU. So for instance, what edition provides self-service password reset, right? So this is this is a pretty typical multiple choice question that you might get. It's just asking you which version, right? Can you do this with free, basic, premium? I can. Oh, am I mic'd at all? Oh, man. Okay, sorry. I can speak way louder. I just didn't want to blow up the mic. Okay. Okay. So, yes, I can absolutely speak louder. Thank you. So, one of the questions you might get is, what version of this, right? In this case, we're talking about Azure AD. So, you get all the options. There's only 3 of them, so it's a pretty easy question. Free, basic, premium. And this is going to require, and so a lot of the questions are not just going to be multiple choice, but they'll probably be choose many, right? Choose all that apply. And so in this case, it's basic and premium. So this is something that you get in all of the tiers except for free. Another thing that you're going to need to know is from a programmatic standpoint or from a REST API, how do you interact with Azure AD, right? And this is similar to how we've interacted with Active Directory in the past. But so they've got today, we do this via the Graph API. So this is a REST API on top of some functionality that we use to do things like update our AD users, query the AD, add, remove, kind of anything you think of kind of from the management perspective that you can do with Azure AD. You're going to be using the Graph API to do that programmatically or through the REST API. There's another version of this that's coming, and it's called Microsoft Graph, which is definitely not going to be on the test today, but this test changes every 60 days, right? So you never know what is going to be on the test tomorrow. So something to look into as it matures through its lifetime. Just know that it's out there, and that it's going to be the next step, the next maturity point for interacting with Azure AD programmatically. And so there's a couple things that you need. So the Graph API is very similar probably to any cloud-based API that you've used, right? You've got to authenticate to it. You've got to get, you've got it to tell it what tenant you're going against, right? There's a couple of things that you need to know. And so you're going to authenticate, you're going to grab your token, and then you're going to be able to reach in and actually make calls and converse back and forth with the API, right? So very standard. You get a tokenized type of authentication that once you have that token, then you can actually communicate back and forth with the Graph API. So another type of question you're going to get is just that, right? What are the components that I need to communicate with the Graph API? I'll give you a hint, there's 3 of them. And it's 1, 2, and 3. So you need the access token, the application key, and the tenant key, or the tenant ID. So you tell it, I've already got an access token, right? I've authenticated against my Azure subscription. I tell it where I'm going and what I want to access, essentially, is what you're giving at that point. I mean, because think about it, when you're looking at Azure AD, you might have several different directories under different subscriptions, so you need to tell it kind of in detail what you actually want to go against for that call. Under the covers today of Azure AD are just industry standards. So it's a beautiful thing that all of this is now implemented kind of in an open way. So we interact with Azure AD much the same way we interact with any other type of authorization and authentication system. And that's with OAuth, specifically OAuth 2.0 and OpenID. Now the way to think about these two very connected things is, so OAuth is an open standard for authorization, right? So authorization, not authentication. So this is telling me what I have access to, right? So combine that then with OpenID Connect, which adds authentication on top of the OAuth standard. So between these two open standards is kind of where Active Directory AD lives. So I can provide, so between those two, I essentially now can implement SSO. And what you need to know about those are what they are, right? Just the definitions here of what they are. There's a ton of key terms. I'm not going to read all of these off of the screen, but you need to know all of the key terms associated with the standards. And these are associated with not necessarily the Active AD implementation, but this is mostly OAuth and OpenID, protocol. So these are standard terms that you're going to be able to use across the board, really when you're talking about those open protocols in addition to just Azure AD. Have a question? Yes, yes. I've been, so those, if you look at the history in the repo, you'll see like a whole cascade of updates that have happened. And I mean, so there's some updates probably pending to update after this. And two, definitely look, sorry, you can't see what I'm pointing at. If you could see down here, there are notes. So under the notes, I've got links to all the appropriate specs. So you'll get questions that are like pinned specifically to details about the OAuth spec or the OpenID spec. And so I've got links in there that'll take you to the exact place. They're large, right? They're large open protocol specifications. So I've got links in there that will take you to the exact places kind of where you need to look for the different information about the spec. And usually that's going to be around this stuff. So that's going to be around the different flows that you can take for OAuth and OpenID. Primarily, we're talking about authorization in this case. And so these are kind of the different paths and the different types of flows. The most interesting is one that's, so the implicit flow. The reason this one is interesting, so the authorization code flow is, for the most part, if you look at the documentation, it's going to be what they note as the standard flow, right? If you look at standard OAuth flow, you're going to see several back and forth. You're going to see a token grant. You're going to see a token refresh. You're going to see a couple of callbacks until you finally have authorization to get to the thing that you want to get to. The implicit flow is a little different, and it's a simplified flow. And what it does is, and this is kind of where the questions are going to come into play. It supports a SPA type environment, right? Where you've got a single page application. You're not actually making a server call, like you're going straight from client to auth. And if you look at that link that I've got in on the bottom of this slide, it'll detail not only how that flow works, but the client library that Microsoft provides you to help make that happen easier for you. And it also shows you how to kind of write it from scratch if you were to need to do that yourself. Like maybe, and there's, I think, in addition to the JavaScript library that Microsoft provides, there's also libraries out there for Angular, for React, for ... framework of the month, right? There's all sorts of stuff out there for this, partly because it's built on top of, open standards, so it's not really Azure or Microsoft specific. This is a little bit of a detailed kind of breakdown of what I talked about, that first flow, right? So you see that the first flow is just that standard OAuth flow, right? That you've probably seen a million times if you've done anything with authorization. The second is that stripped down implicit flow, where you're going to be skipping call it the server-side hop, right? You're going to be going straight from your client to the OAuth provider. So the hiccups there are what? Maybe probably cores, right? That's always a big piece of it. Not every server is going to support cross origin requests. So there's a lot of gotchas you can look at for kind of using one of these flows or the other. And you'll get questions around where are they applicable and where are they not, right? Oh man, I forgot to reset my timer. Sorry, that was a little aside. Okay, Ian reminded me to do that, and I ignored his advice. So for the next piece, there aren't many code questions that you're going to get on this specific test, right? This is mostly around architecting and making the choices, the decisions, but you will get a couple. And one of those that I know, some folks have seen are around this, right? Looking at this and authentication flow, and specifically around what you're probably going to get a question at is maybe some of the callbacks. What would denote a successful flow versus an unsuccessful flow, somebody that is authenticated versus is not. What are the appropriate handlers to use for this or that? So something to look at. So for instance, kind of when using OAuth and OpenID, kind of which handler would let you know that a user is actually valid and logged in, right? Like an active AD user that's successful. And that's going to be authorization code received, right? And one of the tips that we'll give you is that you saw these very different flows, right? There's overlap between some of them, but know which components participate in which flow, right? Look at each page in the documentation is going to kick off with a little bit of an intro, and then it's going to go right into a flow diagram, so you can see visually kind of what goes where, right? So definitely take a look at that. Okay, we're going to move right into hybrid scenarios. So there's really 3 things that you need to know about, right? When you're looking at a hybrid scenario, this is where we're taking Active Directory in the cloud, and we're probably merging it with something else somehow, right? So we don't have just an Active Directory environment in the cloud, we also have one or a hybrid one someplace else, right? So the oldest of technologies in this space would be ADFS, right? And so this is where we're actually federating our identity to somewhere else, right? So let's kind of say that this is our on-prem Active Directory, and we're authenticating to that, but for something else. So we've got a pass through, and this is probably when you look at the kind of description of ADFS, it's probably the richest solution, but also the one that's going to require, and this is probably going to be like a direct question. I'm paraphrasing, but this is going to be the most feature rich, but also the most, or the highest burden as far as implementing infrastructure yourself. Because there's a lot of infrastructure for ADFS that has to be implemented on premise, right? You essentially have to implement an ADFS farm, and so you've got servers that you need to hook up on your own iron to handle this. You've got to handle the high availability. So there's a little bit more of a burden on you versus going with something kind of a little bit more simplistic like AD Connect. So AD Connect has been around for, I'm going to say 2 years, give or take, right? I'm close. So AD Connect is what allows you to actually today synchronize your AD between your on-prem Active Directory and the cloud. And some of the things that are in beta will allow you to go beyond that. But the way this works today is for AD Connect, you install just an AD Connect service, right, on your on-prem Active Directory server, and it pushes your AD to the cloud, and then periodically or on demand, depending on how you need to do it, synchronizes your AD with the cloud, with your Azure AD, right? So you still got your on-prem Active Directory, but then you've got a nice synced version of that for your users anyway. You've got a nice synced version of that in Azure as well. So you get that nice kind of synced, you can authenticate on-prem, you can authenticate in the cloud with the same user, right? The same LDAP user. So what's in beta right now, and will be out very soon, and I imagine on the test very soon, is a single sign-on option that uses AD Connect, but the situation it supports, and it gets a little bit closer to what we get with ADFS, is a pass-through, where instead of syncing, you're not federating either, you're literally passing through. And so you still use AD Connect, you still have that connective glue that it provides, but essentially if you look at the docs and you look at the diagram, what it does is it just passes through, authenticates to your Active Directory, just like it were Azure AD, right? So for all intents and purposes, it thinks that it's the cloud AD, it authenticates, and then you've got your user context, right? So it's a much cleaner approach, still in beta, so it won't be on the test this next go around. I'm not quite sure when it might get updated, but it's something that's definitely being invested in and coming in the future, so something to look at. And right now, it's going to have a couple of restrictions. I'm not going to go into all of this, but there's some kind of having to be attached to a local Active Directory first before you go through this, so you can't necessarily set somebody up through this flow. You guys can dig into this on your own. I don't want to take up too much time kind of talking about something that's kind of a little further out into the future. Instead, let's move on to securing resources by identity provider. So this is looking at kind of 2 different options, so B2B and B2C, right? B2B is essentially where you're going to want to bring somebody that already has a partner account, maybe they're another Azure tenant, maybe they got a Microsoft account, but you want to bring a partner or a customer kind of into your Azure tenant. So you can kind of have that commingled authentication and authorization experience, right? And so this is for kind of enterprise applications, directory users, not customers of a specific application, but kind of a little bit more holistic than that when you're looking at the use for B2B. So one of the scenarios for this is, so say you've got a web app and you need to add users for a partner company. So you're adding external users to your AD, right? And then you want to authenticate through your application using that cloud AD, right? So that's going to be one of the cases where you're going to use B2B. B2C is a little bit more of a standalone product, a standalone thing, where it's going to allow you to, and depending on how much time we have at the end, we've got a lab we can walk through. If not, you guys can do this on your own. But we've got both a B2B and a B2C lab put together. So we can kind of look at this. B2C being one of the more interesting ones. So what it does is it allows you to use existing identity providers. So think Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Twitter, right? So this is a scenario where you're going to be using secondary identity providers to kind of allow their identity to be provided by somebody else that you trust, and then you handle the authorization once they come in, right? And that's going to be a scenario like you want to support single sign-on, right, for your on-premise users, and you want to also add, and here's the kicker for this question, right, and this is kind of where the first part of this question is kind of the same as B2B, right? You're like, okay, sure, I could do that with B2B. The last part of this is the one to kind of key in on, is where you want to add external users using their social logins, right? So you see that, you immediately know B2B is definitely not going to work, so the answer is going to be B2C. Because when you see the social login, just think consumer, right? That's going to be the thing that kind of cues you in on that. So looking at this, just focus on, just like that sample question, focus on the solutions, right? When you look at a given question, or when you're just architecting this yourself, right? Look at the solutions you're trying to solve. Who you're trying to give access to specifically in this case is going to be the one to key in on. You know, who and how, right? If you've got, and maybe this is going to be a hybrid solution where you use both, right? Certainly something that's very valid. Okay, on to, so this is going to be for data security. So looking at data security solutions, we're going to be looking at data at rest. How do we handle that scenario for both storage solutions as well as database solutions, right? So for storage solutions, we're going to be looking at kind of this mix of storage options within Azure. Most of this stuff you guys have probably seen if you've used Azure. Most of this has been around for a while. The one exception there is going to be Data Lake Store, which is fairly new, but it can be thought of very synonymous with blob storage, right? It's essentially, it's a mixture of blob storage and file storage, as a matter of fact. But what it gives you more ACL control, which we'll talk about a little bit more in role-based authentication. But for storage services, what we use is service level encryption, right? This is a built-in feature of the of Azure storage services. So it's essentially just an option within the portal where you say, for this store, I want to encrypt this data, and that's it. Now the interesting thing is, so there's what it. I'm enlarging mine. There's a little bit. So what it does is it actually encrypts it on the way in, right, and decrypts it on the way out. So think about that scenario. What that means is that as say you turn it on and turn it off and turn it on and turn it off, right? So there could be a commingling of encrypted and unencrypted data. So it's not like this. It's not like a true encrypted disk, right? You are talking about a service that you can encrypt some and not encrypt others. So just something to keep in mind. Azure Disk Encryption is going to be something that you're going to use, obviously, at the disk level, right? So this is when you're looking at this scenario that's going to support data encryption. You know what? We'll just go to the next slide. So this is going to be the solution that you're going to use to encrypt your VMs, right? Especially your persistent disks for your VMs. Azure Disk Encryption Services, which uses BitLocker. I almost blanked out there for a second, which uses BitLocker underneath the covers, right? So this is going to actually encrypt your disk. And not only can it be used for your VMs, but also something that you can use to encrypt your backups, which obviously is just as important, right? Moving on to Azure databases. So same problem, right? You need to encrypt your data at rest. And since we're talking about data, we're not really talking about encrypting data in transit, but for the most part, when we talk about data in transit, we talk about SSL, right? So we talk about sending data over an encrypted channel. For data at rest, we're going to talk about the options for some of these. You would have to use something custom. Like right now, there's not a lot of baked-in options for some of the stuff like MySQL or Postgres. But for SQL databases and SQL data warehouse, as well as the stretch, we've got good platform offerings. And this is simply TDE, right? This is transparent disk encryption. And this is a SQL Server feature that supports both encryption in transit as well as at rest. So it handles kind of both sides of the coin. And just kind of know that that's and it's part of both PaaS and IaaS. So this will handle kind of the Azure SQL angle as well as SQL Server in a VM, right? So definitely know kind of where this piece, specifically TDE, plays in the pie, like what it can handle, what it cannot. Essentially, if it's SQL Server, TDE is going to be in play. And I'm not going to dig into it a lot more, but it also does integrate with Key Vault. Key Vault could be a conversation in and of itself. I do not believe that it's covered on the test, although it may come up. So kind of one of those topics to dig into if you have time is to look at kind of how to set up, configure, and then integrate Key Vault with kind of all of these encryption options. Okay, I mentioned there wasn't much code on the test, right? So, yes? I do not know. I don't know if that's on the roadmap or not. We can certainly find out. We'll take that as a follow-up. Cool. Okay. So there is a little bit of code we're going to talk about. So for encrypting data, we've got Azure Storage Client Library. And so this is going to be a client-side library, Node, C#. There's a couple of different places you can use it from that supports actually encrypting the data. So it gives you a client-side API to encrypt the data that you're sending in. So think that you're encrypting, so say for like blob storage, right? And you want to encrypt the data yourself instead of relying on the platform, you can certainly do that. And you can use this library to do that. And kind of knowing how to do that is important, knowing what the API looked like, and specifically what call you would make to actually do the encryption, right? How you would use the policy to encrypt it, what options you would use, then how you would stream it into blob storage. Okay, last but not least, with 3 minutes to go before I dial in Bill, we've got role-based access control, right? So this is, by another name, this is IAM, right? Identity Access Management. So what this is actually really straightforward. When you look at the Azure portal, or if you're looking at it through PowerShell or the CLI, you've got access to roles, right? And then underneath those roles, you've got permissions, right? So this is standard role-based authentication and authorization, where you've got roles and you've got permissions underneath those roles. And then you've got the ability to put users in those roles, as well as create custom roles that you can then add your own permissions to and kind of slice and dice the way you need to specifically for your needs, opposed to just relying on the custom roles. And roles give you the flexibility to manage your resources, right? So roles can give you authorization at the Azure subscription level, at the resource group level, which everybody in here should absolutely dig into resource groups if you've not already. So at the resource group level, which is an organizational level, and then also at the resource level. So all the way down at a specific instance of a thing, right? A VM, a SQL server, a storage account, right? It gives you the granularity to go from authorization here all the way down to here. So I mentioned you also have the option to create custom roles. And so these are going to be, there's a ton of permissions that you can use to roll up. I think the number is, I've got it in my notes somewhere. So there's a lot of permissions. And you've got there's no way you would ever need this many, but you can create up to 2,000 custom roles. And good thing to note, so this can be done both via the portal, via PowerShell, via the CLI, and via the REST API. And what a custom role looks like is this. So essentially you have a list of what you can do, what you can't do, and where that applies, right? That's the makeup of a custom role, which makes sense, right? If you look at this in the portal, this is what it looks like. So we've got we've got tons of roles, and then we've got the permissions that apply to those roles. So you've kind of got that very logical parent-child hierarchy relationship going on. So know how to do it in all those tools, though. Know what makes up a custom role. Know how to assign users to roles. It's probably the easiest thing to do, but very applicable for the exam. Okay. Now I'm going to Skype Bill in. So I've got Hey, Bill. All right, buddy. I've got you set up in front of the group. If you want to share your screen, we can go ahead and get started. Maybe.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. How's everybody doing? Hope everybody's doing all right. To speak when I can't see you. I don't really have much time, so I'm not going to say much about me other than my name is BillWilder, and you can find me on Twitter if you care to. Oops. Let's see. So computer security professionals are obsessed with confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the triangle of concerns and threats that they need to keep their businesses up and running. And what I'm going to focus on are prevention, identifying threats and intrusions, and assessing risks and exposures, and mitigating those challenges from within Azure. And I'll emphasize that Azure subscribes to the public cloud approach that other public clouds follow, which is this shared responsibility model for providing security in the cloud. So Microsoft Azure has a great deal of security capability for its services, and it does a fantastic job protecting those. And that does not automatically completely protect all of your services. So what Azure does is it provides a toolbox for you to use with your own services. And this talk is substantially about how you would use Azure's toolbox to protect your own services, and how Azure can help you manage your visibility into how well you're using the toolbox. And of course, the toolbox and fully utilizing that is only part of the story. For example, if you deploy an application to the cloud that has a SQL injection vulnerability, that vulnerability will port quite nicely. So it's not a silver bullet, but your toolbox is about as sophisticated as you would like it. So let's jump in. I'm mainly going to talk about 3 services, and these are all available within the Azure portal, or within the clouds, actually. So there's, I'll talk briefly about Operations Management Suite, or OMS, and there's a cloud version of that. Now, we're not talking about the on-premises. I'm going to talk about then we're going to talk about and look at in the Azure portal 2 services. One is Activity Log, and one is Azure Security Center, which is quite a nice differentiator for Azure compared to other public cloud offerings. And these combined, these are services that help us be better cloud citizens. They help us ensure that we're using the toolbox available to us to the fullest. So let's jump in and briefly talk about OMS. As I mentioned, this is a cloud-hosted pane of glass for looking at first-party services for sure. So if you're using it on your Azure resources, it can certainly give you a view into all of those. It knows about Azure. But beyond that, OMS has a wider capability. And within Azure, it can do a good job of gathering log information and intel from third-party appliances. For example, a Barracuda firewall or WAF, Sophos firewall, various other kinds of appliances that you might find in the Azure marketplace. Beyond that, and in fact, that is probably the best way for you to manage most of those resources if you are deploying them to Azure. So if you're deploying non-first-party services in Azure, this is something you're going to want to look at. And then beyond that, other clouds, the bookstore and Google and even on-premises, private clouds and so forth, anything that you can install an agent on, any virtual machine, for example, can integrate back into OMS. So it's a complete, single pane of glass for spanning your infrastructure. It has other capabilities that relate to the CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, in particular the availability aspect here with backups and site recovery. It has powerful monitoring and alerting capabilities. We're going to look at similar monitoring, and alerting capabilities within Azure Security Center in a minute. But some of the things you can do within OMS is you can monitor for certain situations and then take action automatically based on those. You can run in Azure what's known as a run book, which is, I'm not sure if it's included in the two-day program, but it's basically PowerShell scripts that you can host within Azure highly reliably, monitored so that they're always available, audited, and so forth, to execute any kind of activity, remediation activity that you want. And just as a general capability, also webhooks, which allows you to execute actions even outside of Azure if that were desirable. And as mentioned in contrast, Azure Security Center is more substantially, at least currently, focused on Microsoft Azure first-party services. And then the second of the services that are relevant for this part of the conversation, this is activity logs. This is your audit trail for control plane activity. If you're not familiar with the term, sometimes the term management plane is used, and this is as opposed to the data plane. So control plane is operations that allow you to do things such as create a cloud resource, like instantiate an Azure storage account, or shut down a virtual machine, or delete a resource group. These are actions that happen on the resources themselves, not within the resources. Those are data plane activities, such as running a SQL query, logging into a virtual machine, installing software on a virtual machine. Those are all considered data plane. So the activity log is your audit trail for the control plane. So, of course, these are privileged activities. You need to have through the role-based access control mechanism within the Azure portal, you need to be given the permission to perform control plane activities in the first place, as opposed to, say, your users, your end users may be performing data plane activities within your databases, for example, or maybe logging into services. And the activity log queries will help you figure out who did what, when, on which resources, what the outcome was, and some of the properties so that you can understand what happened. And then very quickly, Azure Security Center, this spans activities in the control plane and the data plane. It provides monitoring, alerting, allows you to apply some mitigations right in Service Center itself, Security Center itself, and some policies that you configure. And this is your single pane of glass to understand how well you're using the Azure Security Toolbox. This is the best place to find that out, and also has alerts to tell you about other badness. So given let's jump over into a demo and look at that in a little more detail. I have in here, I'm in the Azure portal, and I've selected the activity log blade. And within this activity log blade, I've asked for all categories of activities in the past 2 weeks of all severities. I haven't filtered it by a particular person, but I could. For example, this person here, if I type this in here, I could see just what that person did if I'm exploring an incident with a particular user, for example. Different resource types can be filtered on. App service plans, app dynamics, the new Cosmos DB. Pretty much you'll find all the expected Azure resources in there. And let's look at a couple of these. So listing some keys within a, let's see if we, unfortunately, I couldn't really convince the portal to show me this in more detail. So hopefully folks can see this okay, but I'm going to scroll along the bottom here. So this is telling me who the caller was of this action, which is here, which is a storage account action that lists the keys. So it's audited that somebody got the storage keys for an Azure storage account, and it was this person. And it even shows these are the AAD claims about this person. All the expected claims are in here. This is the person's name, unique identifier, and so forth. And let's look at a couple others real quick. This is a diagnostic alert that was issued by Application Insights. Was that? That's up here, telling us that was Application Insights generated this. And you can see there's a whole handful of others. Given that I only have about another minute or two, let me just register that this is a pretty powerful tool. You can create custom queries and save them for your operations team. And let's use the rest of our time on Azure Security Center. So as mentioned, this is the single pane of glass that helps you know if you are not taking advantage of some of the Azure tools, the security tools. This is an interesting alert here. Your security experience may be limited. If I click this, which I won't, because it'll take too long, but it'll explain to you that there are other areas of your infrastructure that you could on data collection for. So you typically would want to do that. This is a low-value dev account, so we don't have all the security capabilities in place for that. So it has recommendations. It has third-party solutions. For example, it might recommend a third-party firewall. It has alerts and policies that you can configure. So I'm going to just scroll down here. It has 2 security alerts. So this is a proactive alert management. It tells me my 2 most attacked resources. So let's look at this second one here. A possible SQL injection vulnerability was detected on this database. And it tells me when, and I can drill in to get more detail. And I know that one happens to be benign. And here's another one. This is a virtual machine, and it tells me that somebody tried to brood in with the RDP password. It failed. We have a very complex password on that. And further, if I can, I'm going to go into recommendations. And this is listing a number of areas that I can make improvements on. And as an example, I don't have, so there's some virtual machines here that I haven't applied disk encryption on, and I could. So I could enable hard disk encryption for added protection. Add a next generation firewall. This will tell me again about 3 endpoints that don't have firewalls. Enable network security groups. A network security group is another kind of firewall. It's a layer 3 or layer 4 firewall that locks down at the IP or protocol level. And so it's free, so it's a very easy one to apply. And I could go in, for example, with one of these resources, get more detail. These are the networks, and I've just asked it to create a network security group. It didn't show that very cleanly, but just to illustrate that you can create some of these resources directly within the Azure portal. And let's just give one more example with system updates. And you can see that some of these dev machines have security patches that are out of date. And actually, let's go with this last one. Enable transparent data encryption in my SQL database. So this dev database here. And click through on this. And right in the Azure portal, there's a common experience. I can click data encryption on and hit save, and it will go right ahead and it will enable transparent data encryption in that database. So I'm going to stop there, and I think my 10 minutes have quickly expired. So can I ask if there are any questions, or if I'll turn it back to Steve to either direct questions to me or move on.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. It should, yeah. So I think it's going to, so we can, yeah. I know the answer to that. I don't have to go to Bill. Thank you, Bill.
Okay, thanks, folks.
Cool. I'm going to re-mic. Okay, so I think what we've got now is lab time. Dan, is that correct? Okay. I will, I will use it briefly. So one of the things I wanted to show you guys is just looking at, if we look at the portal, just see some of this stuff in action, right? So you can see a little bit more than just what we're talking about in the slides. Look at how, so just look at role-based authentication being one of those, how easy it is to set up storage encryption. So we'll start there since that's really easy. I've already got a couple of resources set up for this talk. So if we look here, I've got a storage account set up, right? And so this is storage. This is just going to be blob file queue table as well. And so when you look at this, you've got settings that are across the board for all of these services. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you see that we've also got settings for each service. So settings for blob, file, table, queue, right? Let's take queue and tables out of the conversation for right now. For both blob and our blob storage as well as file storage service, we've got the service level encryption option, right? So I mentioned how easy this was. There's literally not a lot that you can do, even if you wanted to. You have the option to click on it and enable it or disable it, right? You can dig in a little bit more as to kind of what it actually does. It's got the kind of blurb here on the screen. They'll tell you about it. Then you can dig in a little bit further into the documentation. But this is it. All right, this is all you have to do, and then hit save. And now I'm done, right? So that's how easy it is to enable encryption for both blob and file storage. This is specifically for blob, but if I did the same thing just a little bit further down in the UI, we could do it for file storage as well. And then looking at, we just saw, so Bill demoed for us turning on TDE for SQL Server, right? For a specific SQL Server, just as easy. It's literally just enable this and we're good to go. So if we get back out, so one of the things we talked about is just role-based authentication in general, right? RBAC. So we're going to get to that by going to the users and groups. I guess I'm going to have to search for this. Okay. So we're going to look at users and groups. So this is where we're going to actually have access to our Azure Active Directory. And the specific subscription, the mappings between ADs and subscriptions are a little weird, but there's actually 4 different directories that are mixed between, like, I think I've got 10 subscriptions, give or take. I've got a lot. There's a lot of subscriptions in the mix. So you're going to see not necessarily a one-to-one mapping between your subscriptions and your directories. As a matter of fact, it's the reverse that you would expect it to be. You're actually going to see subscriptions underneath a directory as opposed to what you would think is directories underneath the subscription, right? But once you're here, so now I'm in a specific directory, and I can manage the users and the groups for this directory. So that's everything from adding new users to kind of looking through the list, looking through the audit logs. But if we go into, since we're talking about RBAC, let's look at the all groups. And I haven't created any yet. So this is where I can create one of my new groups, right? And so a group, in addition to what we talked about, roles and permissions, is just like an AD group, right? You've got a grouping, right? Bob's group, or system admins, or whatever, right? So this is where you can actually give a name and create an actual group. So if we look at this, so we're just going to do Steve's group. And then under the description, doesn't matter. I don't know if that's optional, so we're going to give it something. So the membership type. So this is where, there we go. Enable office features, no. And then we can add users to this group. Let's select one. There should only be one in here. There we go. Let's select him, create. Okay, so now I've got my grouping. So this allows me to take, instead of granting those roles and permissions we saw as part of RBAC to a specific person, or just grouping of people that way, we can create groups and land them in that group. And then we actually give the group permission. So if I look at that group, we looked at the members, so I can add and remove members from here. You got group members, and then we can take a look at kind of who owns this, the Azure resources it has access to. So this is interesting where you're looking at, you're not going to see anything yet, where this user is not assigned access to any specific resources, no permissions, all of that. Okay, let me dig into a specific user. Actually, let me back up. Let me get into a specific resource group. This is the resource group that I created for just these demos, right? So I've got, this is where I had my, my storage account, right? And resource groups, I mentioned this is not specific to security, but it's kind of specific to everything. So resource groups are where you want to group logical things together. And you can do this, you can team up resource groups, and they're probably going to talk about VNets and kind of networking in the cloud later on. But kind of a combination of resource groups, VNets, and then the ACLs, or the access control list associated with those things, gives you isolation, where you can make sure that only this can talk to this. For instance, maybe you want to secure your SQL Server, right? You only want a Azure website to be able to speak to your SQL Server. You do not want the outside world to have access to that for obvious reasons, right? Brute force attacks, data leaks, any number of things. So using a combination of permissions, groups, resource groups, as well as virtual networking allows you to make sure that you have that perfectly segmented at a network level, as well as a kind of a permission and an access level. So it gives you both sides of the coin to secure kind of your cloud-only resources that you never want somebody outside of Azure or outside of your subscription or even outside of that specific resource group to have access to. It's also really good for talks and demos because it allows me to tag everything within a resource group and then delete it all when I'm done so I'm not overspending. So when I look at this, so when I look at the resource group, right, so I've got kind of all of these properties and everything associated with the resource group. When I look at access control, so this is, I mentioned IAM, right, IAM. So this is your identity access management. So when I look at access control, this is where I can add, remove, tweak. So this is where I'm going to have, where I'm either adding specific users to have access to this group, or I'm adding groups, right, like the one I just created. So what that looks like is just very simply kind of adding a role to a person. So for this, so for a resource group, and really for a lot of things, you've got a whole list of permissions that you can add, right? So when you add somebody to give them access to a resource group or most any other type of resource within Azure, you select the permissions you want to give them, and then you map that. You know, it's a mapping between the user and that type of resource or that resource group. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Let us roll right into lab time, and then shortly after that, I believe the next talk is at 2:35.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. The labs are live. I just posted the final, so everybody's got their labs in. GitHub.com /D Stoltz, DSTOLTS, and /70-534. And I'm going to put that up on the screen as soon as I connect.